No benefits, no claims. He's a fake vet. My wife jeered at the divorce settlement reading. She didn't notice my lawyer had slipped the judge an unopened envelope. The judge's face went pale. Officers, seal this court immediately. You know that feeling when you're watching a train wreck in slow motion, except you're tied to the tracks? Yeah, that was me, sitting in divorce court on what I'd later call the day my life got interesting again. The whole scene felt like some twisted reality TV show where I was both the contestant and the prize nobody really wanted. There I was, wedged between my lawyer Grant Morrison and a wooden chair that had probably witnessed more human misery than a customer service hotline, listening to my soon-to-be ex-wife Monica deliver what could only be described as the performance of her lifetime. And let me tell you, this woman had been practicing. She stood there in her best wronged woman outfit. You know the one. All blacks and grays like she was mourning our marriage instead of trying to bury it 6 feet under, gesturing dramatically like she was auditioning for Broadway. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying that special blend of fake vulnerability and genuine spite that only comes from years of perfecting the art of being professionally offended. This man has been living a lie our entire marriage. No benefits, no claims. He's a fake vet. The words came out of her mouth like venom from a particularly theatrical snake, each syllable dripping with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who don't return their shopping carts. I had to give her credit. The delivery was flawless. She'd clearly been workshopping this material for months, probably in front of her bathroom mirror while practicing her victim face. The judge looked about as entertained as a DMV employee on a Monday morning, but Monica was just getting warmed up. She launched into this whole sob story about how I'd deceived her about my military service, how I'd stolen valor from real heroes, and how she'd been married to a fraud for 8 years. The really rich part? My family. And by family, I mean her family plus my own mother and sister who'd apparently joined Team Monica somewhere along the way, sat behind her like some kind of demented Greek chorus, nodding along and making sympathetic noises at all the right moments. My sister actually had the audacity to dab at her eyes with a tissue. I couldn't tell if she was crying from emotion or trying not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Monica's lawyer, this peacock of a man named Trevor who looked like he'd gotten his legal degree from a Cracker Jack box, kept encouraging her with little nods and mms, like she was delivering the Gettysburg Address instead of a carefully crafted character assassination. The guy's suit was so shiny I was half convinced he'd borrowed it from a game show host. And his smile was the kind you see on used car salesmen who are about to sell you a lemon with sugar on top. But here's the thing about being underestimated your whole life. You get really good at keeping your poker face. So I sat there, calm as a lake before a storm, watching my wife perform her one-woman show about what a disappointing excuse for a human being I was. She talked about my dead-end library job, which wasn't even close to what I actually did, but we'll get to that. My complete lack of ambition, and my pathological need to make up stories about serving my country. The crowd was eating it up. I could practically hear the mental applause track running in their heads. Monica was really hitting her stride now, gesturing toward me like I was Exhibit A in a museum of human failures. He sits at home reading books all day, she continued, making up these elaborate fantasies about being some kind of secret agent or whatever. It's honestly sad, Your Honor. I've wasted the best years of my life on a man who thinks Tom Clancy novels count as autobiography. That one actually stung a little, not because it was true, but because of how confidently she delivered it. This woman had shared a bed with me for 8 years and genuinely believed I was nothing more than a glorified librarian with delusions of grandeur. In her mind, the most exciting thing I'd ever done was probably organize the fiction section by publication date instead of alphabetically. I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing that her words had any effect. Instead, I just sat there thinking about all the things she didn't know, all the places I'd been that weren't on any tourist map, all the decisions I'd made that kept people like her safe enough to stand in a courthouse and call me a fraud. But hey, why ruin the surprise? Grant, my lawyer, was sitting next to me like some kind of legal monk who'd taken a vow of strategic silence. The guy was former military Jack, dry as week-old toast, and twice as sharp. He had this way of listening that made you think he was cataloging every word for future use, which, as it turned out, he absolutely was. While Monica was building her case against my character, Grant was calmly preparing what I like to think of as our nuclear option. I watched him reach into his briefcase, slowly, deliberately, like he was handling nitroglycerin, and pull out a sealed envelope. Not just any envelope, mind you. This thing had an official wax seal on it, the kind you don't see outside of historical dramas and very, very important government correspondence. He held it for a moment, timing his move like a chess grandmaster planning checkmate in 3 moves. Then, just as Monica was reaching the crescendo of her performance, just as she was really getting the crowd worked up about what a pathetic disappointment of a husband I was, Grant slid that envelope across the table to the judge with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you're holding all the aces. I'll never forget the look on Judge Harrison's face when he cracked that wax seal. The man went through more facial expressions in 10 seconds than most people cycle through in a week. First, there was mild curiosity, probably wondering what kind of dramatic flourish my lawyer was going for. Then confusion as he started reading. Then his eyebrows shot up like they were trying to escape his forehead entirely. Finally, his face settled into an expression I can only describe as, oh, holy hell. If his poker face had been a house, it would have been foreclosed, demolished, and turned into a parking lot in the span of about 30 seconds. He went from looking bored and slightly annoyed to looking like he'd just been handed evidence that aliens had landed and were demanding to speak to the manager of Earth. The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of Monica's heels clicking as she shifted her weight, still riding the high of her performance and waiting for the applause that would never come. She was looking at the judge expectantly, probably expecting him to bang his gavel and declare her the winner of Divorce Court Survivor. Instead, Judge Harrison looked up from that letter, his face now completely serious, and said the words that would change everything. "Officers, seal this court immediately." The sound of those words hitting the air was like dropping a brick into a still pond. Everything stopped. The casual chatter from the gallery died instantly. Even Monica's theatrical breathing seemed to pause mid-inhale. Then came the real sound effects, the heavy footsteps of bailiffs moving to the doors, the solid thunk of locks clicking into place, the metallic scrape of deadbolts sliding home. That's when Monica's Oscar-worthy performance hit its first snag. Her confident smirk, the one she'd been wearing like a crown throughout her entire testimony, collapsed faster than a cheap camping chair in a hurricane. For the first time since we'd walked into this courtroom, she looked genuinely confused instead of strategically devastated. Her eyes darted from the sealed doors to the judge to me, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly had too many pieces. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered all those family dinners where she'd rolled her eyes at everything I said. All those times she'd introduced me as just a librarian, with that little laugh that suggested even that was giving me too much credit. All those moments when she'd made it crystal clear that in her mind, I was the supporting character in the movie of her life. The judge was still holding that letter, and I could see his hands were actually trembling slightly. Whatever Grant had put in that envelope, it had definitely gotten the man's attention. Monica was starting to look like someone who'd just realized they'd been playing poker with a deck full of wild cards they didn't know existed. Let me paint you a picture of my marriage to Monica, because honestly, it was like watching a sitcom where all the laugh tracks had been replaced with the sound of my soul slowly deflating. You know those shows where the husband is basically a golden retriever in human form, well-meaning but perpetually confused, while the wife gets all the good lines and most of the screen time. Yeah, that was us. Except nobody was laughing and the ratings were tanking faster than my self-esteem. Monica loved being the star of her own little production, and I'll give her credit where it's due. She was damn good at it. The woman could command a room like she was born with a spotlight following her around. Every conversation, every social gathering, every mundane trip to the grocery store somehow became the Monica Show, featuring special guest appearance by my husband, the librarian. And me? I was relegated to the role of laugh track, expected to provide supportive chuckles and nods at all the right moments while she delivered her material. Take our family dinners, for instance. These weren't just meals. They were Monica's weekly TED Talks on how to live your best life according to someone who'd read exactly 3 self-help books and watched every episode of Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. She'd hold court at the head of the table. And yes, she always sat at the head, even in our own dining room, regaling whoever would listen with stories about her yoga studio's incredible growth trajectory, or some life-changing seminar she'd attended about manifesting abundance through positive visualization. I'd sit there, sawing through whatever overpriced organic chicken she'd insisted on buying from the farmer's market, listening to her explain to my own mother how I could benefit from incorporating more mindfulness into my daily routine. Because apparently, 8 years of marriage had given her a PhD in what was wrong with me and how to fix it. The really rich part was watching my mom nod along like Monica was dropping profound wisdom instead of regurgitating stuff she'd heard on a podcast while getting her nails done. "Jack just doesn't understand the power of setting intentions," Monica would say, gesturing with her fork like she was conducting an orchestra of enlightenment. "He approaches life so passively, like he's waiting for things to happen to him instead of making them happen." She'd give me this patronizing smile that was supposed to look loving but felt more like being patted on the head by someone who thought you were cute but not particularly bright. The worst part? I'd actually try to contribute to these conversations. Call me optimistic, call me stupid, but every once in a while I'd attempt to share something about my day, thinking maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time she'd actually listen instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I remember one particular evening when I'd gotten a quiet commendation from work. Couldn't tell her what for, obviously, but it was the kind of recognition that meant something, the kind that came with a handshake from people who didn't hand out praise like Halloween candy. So I mentioned it, casually, the way you might mention catching a good movie or finding a decent parking spot. "Got some recognition at work today," I said, trying not to sound too proud, but wanting to share it with the person who was supposed to care about my wins, small as they might seem. Monica looked up from her quinoa salad, because of course it was quinoa, and rolled her eyes so hard I was surprised they didn't fall out and roll across the table. "Oh, like Employee of the Month. That's adorable, honey." The way she said adorable made it sound like I'd just announced I'd learned to tie my shoes or successfully used the potty like a big boy. "Did you get a certificate to put on the refrigerator?" Her sister Emma, who was visiting that week and had apparently gotten a contact high from Monica's condescension, actually giggled. Like my professional achievements were some kind of cute joke between the grown-ups. That's when it hit me like a freight train carrying a load of uncomfortable truths. I wasn't her husband in any meaningful sense of the word. I was her unpaid intern, there to nod appreciatively at her brilliance and provide a stable income while she pursued her passions. And what passions they were. Monica had gone through more career phases than a Hollywood actor desperately trying to avoid being typecast. There was the boutique clothing store that was going to revolutionize sustainable fashion. It lasted 6 months and revolutionized my credit card debt. Then came the life coaching certification that was going to help her empower other women to find their authentic selves. Turns out the market for authentic self-discovery was disappointingly small in our suburban neighborhood. After that was the essential oils phase, where our house smelled like a hippie commune, and every conversation somehow circled back to how lavender could cure everything from anxiety to athlete's foot. But the yoga studio. Oh, the yoga studio was her masterpiece. Monica talked about that place like she discovered fire and invented the wheel simultaneously. Every day brought new updates about class attendance, instructor drama, or some revolutionary breathing technique she'd learned from a visiting guru who looked suspiciously like a guy named Steve from Ohio, but claimed to have studied with monks in Tibet. Today we had 15 people in my advanced flow class. She'd announce over dinner like she was reporting quarterly earnings to shareholders. 15. Sarah Jenkins said it was the most transformative experience of her week. She'd pause for effect, waiting for me to appropriately marvel at this achievement. I'm thinking of adding a second advanced class, maybe even a workshop series on finding your inner warrior. I'd make the appropriate impressed noises, because that's what supporting spouses do, right? They celebrate their partner's victories, no matter how small or how many times they've heard about them. But inside, I couldn't help thinking about my own day, which had involved making decisions that actually mattered, solving problems that weren't related to whether the reception desk feng shui was optimal for attracting positive energy. The thing about living with someone who thinks they're the star of their own reality show is that eventually, you start to feel like a background extra in your own life. Monica had this way of making everything about her orbit, like she was the sun and the rest of us were just planets lucky enough to bask in her light. Conversations weren't exchanges. They were performances where she was both the actor and the audience, and I was the guy holding the cue cards. Take our social life, for example. Monica loved entertaining, loved being the hostess who brought people together and facilitated meaningful connections. At least, that's how she saw it. From my perspective, our dinner parties were elaborate theater productions where Monica got to showcase her latest interests while I played the role of bartender, conversation facilitator, and cleanup crew rolled into one. Jack, honey, could you refresh everyone's drinks? She'd say in the middle of explaining to our guests why they should really consider switching to a plant-based diet. Not because she was plant-based herself, she was still working through her relationship with cheese, but because she'd read this fascinating article about the environmental impact of livestock farming. And maybe bring out those little appetizers I made, the ones with the cashew cream. I'd dutifully play waiter while Monica held court, discussing everything from local politics to the latest documentary she'd watched about the dangers of processed foods. She had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them with anyone within earshot. Meanwhile, I'd circulate with drinks and hors d'oeuvres, listening to fragments of conversations where my wife was explaining to other people how they could improve their lives if they just embraced her particular brand of enlightenment. The guests loved her, of course. Monica was charming, articulate, and passionate about her beliefs. She made people feel heard and valued, at least when they were agreeing with her. It was only when you lived with her that you started to notice how exhausting it was to be constantly performing in someone else's show. But here's the thing that really got to me. Monica genuinely believed she was helping me become a better person. In her mind, all her suggestions, critiques, and gentle corrections were acts of love. She was like a personal trainer for my entire existence, constantly pushing me to reach my potential, which in her estimation was considerably higher than my current performance level. "You have so much more to offer the world, Jack," she'd say during one of our increasingly frequent relationship talks, which were really just Monica explaining what was wrong with me and how I could fix it. "You're smart, you're capable, but you're playing it so safe. When was the last time you took a real risk? When was the last time you did something that scared you?" If only she knew. If only I could tell her about the kinds of risks I took on a Tuesday afternoon, the kinds of decisions that kept me awake at night not because I was afraid of making them, but because I had to live with the consequences. But I couldn't, so I'd sit there nodding like she was sharing profound insights instead of projecting her own restlessness onto my supposedly unfulfilled life. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Here was this woman, married to someone whose job literally involved protecting people like her from threats she couldn't even imagine, lecturing me about living life to the fullest and embracing adventure. While she was searching for her authentic self through yoga poses and essential oil combinations, I was out there making sure she had the luxury of that search. But I kept my mouth shut, played my role, and let her believe what she needed to believe. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell someone the truth they're not ready to hear. And Monica? She was definitely not ready to hear that her boring, underachieving husband might actually be the most interesting person in the room. You know how some people collect stamps or vintage baseball cards? Well, my in-laws collected nicknames for me, and their crown jewel was the librarian. Not Jack, not their daughter's husband, not even Hey You. Nope, I was officially the librarian. Like it was my superhero identity, except the only power it came with was the ability to make people underestimate you so completely they'd probably ask you to organize their sock drawer by the Dewey Decimal System. The whole thing started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as anything involving Monica's family could start, during one of our early dating encounters, and I used the term encounter because calling them meetings would imply they were pleasant. Monica's mother asked what I did for work. I gave her the standard cover story, government research, mostly desk work, lots of reading and analysis. Which wasn't technically a lie, just creatively edited for public consumption. Like saying a Navy SEAL does swimming and fitness training. But Monica's mom, Helen, had this way of hearing what she wanted to hear and then amplifying it through the family gossip network until the original message came back unrecognizable. By the time my job description had made its rounds through the Jensen family telephone tree, I'd somehow been transformed from government analyst to works with books to basically a librarian to just the librarian. The progression was like watching a game of telephone played by people who weren't really paying attention in the first place. Monica's father, Big Jim, and yes, he actually insisted people call him Big Jim, like he was running a used car lot instead of an insurance agency. Latched onto this librarian thing with the enthusiasm of a man who'd finally found someone he could feel intellectually superior to. Here was this guy who'd peaked in high school football and had been coasting on that glory for 35 years. And suddenly he had a son-in-law who he was convinced spent his days shushing people and stamping due dates on romance novels. "Hey there, librarian," became his standard greeting whenever I walked into a room, delivered with the kind of hearty backslapping bonhomie that men like Big Jim think passes for affection. "How are all those books treating you? Find any good stories lately?" He'd wink at whoever else was in the room, like he'd just delivered comedy gold instead of the same tired joke he'd been recycling for 3 years. But it was Monica's brother Julian who really perfected the art of turning my supposed profession into a weapon of casual cruelty. Julian was one of those guys who'd graduated from college with a business degree and a chip on his shoulder about not being as successful as he thought he deserved to be. He worked in sales for some medical device company, which meant he spent most of his time trying to convince doctors to buy slightly different versions of things they already had. But in Julian's mind, this made him a corporate warrior fighting on the front lines of capitalism. The first time Julian really unloaded on me was at Monica's birthday party 2 years into our marriage. The whole family was there, plus some of Monica's friends from her yoga instructor training program, and everyone was having a grand old time celebrating the amazing woman who'd somehow ended up with such a disappointingly ordinary husband. I was in the kitchen refilling the ice bucket, because of course I was. The librarian always got the grunt work, when Julian strolled in with that particular swagger that comes from having had just enough beer to think you're funnier than you actually are. "Hey, librarian," he said, not bothering to lower his voice even though we were standing about 3 feet from the living room where everyone else was gathered. "Think you could fetch me another drink? Maybe alphabetize it while you're at it." He laughed at his own joke like he'd just invented comedy, then leaned against the counter with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about whether his words might have consequences beyond hurt feelings. I looked at this guy, really looked at him, standing there in his khakis and polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments, grinning like he'd just scored a touchdown instead of making the same lame joke his father had been making for years. Julian had this soft, pampered look that comes from a lifetime of having other people solve his problems for him. His biggest crisis was probably running out of his favorite energy drinks or having to wait more than 5 minutes for his coffee order. "Sure thing, Julian," I said, opening the refrigerator and pulling out another beer. "You want this in order of alcohol content, or should I arrange it by how much it's going to contribute to that gut you're developing?" I handed him the bottle with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Because I'm thinking we might want to switch you to something with fewer calories. You know, for health reasons." The look on his face was priceless. Julian wasn't used to pushback, especially not from someone he'd mentally filed under harmless nerd. For a second, he just stood there blinking like someone had just explained quantum physics to him in ancient Greek. Then his face went through this interesting color progression from normal to pink to red to what could only be described as angry lobster. But here's the thing about bullies. They're only tough when they think they're punching down. The moment they encounter any real resistance, they fold like a cheap suit in a rainstorm. Julian muttered something about learning to take a joke and wandered back to the living room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the satisfying knowledge that I'd just won a battle he didn't even know we were fighting. That should have been the end of it, but Julian was nothing if not persistent. Over the months that followed, he seemed to make it his personal mission to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy every chance he got. Family barbecues, holiday dinners, random Sunday visits. Julian was always there with some comment about how I should stick to what I know, or asking if I needed help with anything too complicated for a librarian to handle. The really twisted part was how the rest of the family just went along with it. Monica would laugh and tell Julian to be nice to Jack, but in that way that suggested she thought his teasing was fundamentally harmless, like he was picking on his little brother instead of systematically undermining her husband's dignity. Her parents would chuckle and shake their heads like boys will be boys, completely missing the fact that one of these boys was in his 30s and should have outgrown the playground bully routine about 15 years ago. Even my own family started buying into the narrative. My mother, bless her heart, began introducing me to her friends as my son the librarian, with this proud smile like she was announcing I'd cured cancer. My sister would make jokes about how I probably knew where to find anything in the house because of my professional organizing skills. They meant well, but watching my actual life get erased and replaced with this fictional version was like being slowly buried under a pile of well-intentioned misunderstandings. The worst part wasn't the jokes or the casual dismissals. It was the way people started treating me like I was made of glass. Like librarians were some protected species that needed to be spoken to in gentle tones and kept away from anything too stressful or complicated. At family gatherings, conversations about current events would literally pause when I walked into the room, as if the adults had decided the librarian couldn't handle discussions about real-world problems. "Oh, Jack probably doesn't follow politics much," Helen would say when someone brought up international tensions or economic policy. "He's more interested in literary things." She'd say literary things the way most people would say interpretive dance or collecting bottle caps, like it was a harmless but ultimately pointless hobby that kept me occupied and out of trouble. Meanwhile, I'd be standing there thinking about classified briefings I'd sat through, about strategic decisions I'd helped implement, about geopolitical situations I understood better than any of them could imagine. But I couldn't say any of that, so I'd just nod and smile and let them believe whatever made them comfortable. Because the alternative, explaining that their mild-mannered librarian had spent years in places they couldn't find on a map, doing things they wouldn't understand even if I could tell them, would have shattered their comfortable little worldview. The irony was so thick you could have used it to stop bullets. Here I was, surrounded by people who thought bravery meant asking for extra toppings at Subway, listening to them explain how the world worked while they lived in a bubble of suburban safety that existed specifically because people like me were willing to step outside it. Julian would lecture me about taking risks and seizing opportunities while the biggest gamble in his life was trying a new flavor of energy drink. But the absolute peak of the whole librarian experience came at Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, when Julian had clearly been sampling the wine a little too enthusiastically and decided to share his thoughts on my career prospects. The whole extended family was there, including some cousins I'd never met and Monica's grandmother, who was 93 and sharp as a tack, but had apparently decided I was too boring to bother remembering my name. "You know what Jack's problem is?" Julian announced to the table, gesturing with his fork like he was conducting a seminar on personal failure. "No ambition. He's perfectly happy just existing, reading other people's stories instead of making his own." He looked around the table for support, getting encouraging nods from people who apparently thought this was an appropriate topic for holiday dinner conversation. "I mean, come on, dude," he continued, now addressing me directly with the kind of aggressive friendliness that drunk guys use when they're about to say something they'll pretend they don't remember the next day. "When was the last time you took a real risk? When was the last time you did something that actually mattered? You're like a professional spectator." The table went quiet except for the sound of silverware on plates and the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time. Everyone was looking at me expectantly, waiting to see how the mild-mannered librarian would respond to this challenge. Monica was shooting me warning looks, probably worried I'd embarrass her by getting defensive or, God forbid, fighting back. I took a sip of wine, set down my glass, and looked Julian right in the eye. "You're absolutely right, Julian," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I should definitely be more like you. Selling medical equipment to people who already know what they need, making commission off other people's emergencies. That's real heroism right there. That's making a difference." I smiled that same all-teeth, no-warmth smile I perfected over years of dealing with people who mistook politeness for weakness. "Tell me, how many lives have you saved this week? Because I'd love to hear about your latest achievements in the high-stakes world of, what was it again? Surgical instrument sales." The silence that followed was the kind you usually only hear in libraries, which seemed appropriate, given my supposed profession. Julian's face went through that same color progression again, but this time he didn't have a snappy comeback. "Turns out when you're used to punching down, it's hard to adjust when someone punches back. But even after moments like that, even after I'd proven I wasn't quite the pushover they'd imagined, the librarian nickname stuck. Because people believe what they want to believe, and what Monica's family wanted to believe was that they were better than me. Smarter, more successful, more important to the world. And if I was just a librarian, harmless, predictable, forgettable, then that story could stay intact. Here's the thing about living a double life. It's not nearly as glamorous as Hollywood makes it look. There's no dramatic music swelling when you switch identities, no cool gadgets that fit perfectly in your jacket pocket, and definitely no beautiful women throwing themselves at you because you know 17 different ways to kill someone with a paperclip. Mostly, it's just exhausting. It's like being a method actor who never gets to break character, even when the cameras stop rolling. By day, I was Jack Morrison, mild-mannered government researcher who got excited about proper filing systems and knew way too much about the intricacies of bureaucratic procedure. I wore khakis and button-down shirts, carried a sensible briefcase, and drove a Honda Accord that blended into traffic like it was designed by a committee of beige paint enthusiasts. I was the kind of guy who people forgot they'd met 5 minutes after shaking my hand, which, as it turned out, was exactly the point. But behind all that carefully constructed mediocrity, there was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't have a business card or a LinkedIn profile or any of the other digital breadcrumbs that define modern existence. In that other world, the world Monica never knew existed, my name wasn't Mr. Librarian or Jack the Disappointing Husband. It was Echo 7, and that designation meant something to people who mattered in ways that Monica's yoga studio membership never would. Case Officer, Defense Intelligence Agency. Which sounds impressive until you realize that most people think the CIA and the FBI are the same thing. So explaining the subtle differences between various government intelligence agencies is like trying to teach calculus to someone who's still struggling with basic math. But for those keeping score, the DIA is the military's version of the CIA, except we focus on threats that could turn into actual shooting wars instead of just really awkward diplomatic dinners. The work itself was exactly as boring and exactly as terrifying as you'd expect from a job that involved making split-second decisions about whether intelligence reports were credible enough to act on, or if waiting for more confirmation might mean missing the opportunity to prevent something catastrophic. We're talking about the kind of calls where "I was wrong" could mean anything from a diplomatic embarrassment to a body count that would make international headlines for all the wrong reasons. While Monica was at home practicing her warrior pose and explaining to her yoga students how to find their inner strength, I was halfway around the world trying to figure out if a source in Beirut was feeding us legitimate intelligence about weapons shipments or if he was just telling us what he thought we wanted to hear so he could keep collecting his monthly stipend. While she was debating whether to add a meditation component to her advanced flow class, I was analyzing satellite imagery to determine if those shipping containers in the port of Karachi actually contained agricultural equipment or if they were hiding something that could level a city block. The really beautiful part was the complete disconnect between what Monica thought constituted high-stakes decision-making and what actually qualified as life-or-death pressure. She'd come home from the yoga studio absolutely beside herself because one of her instructors had quit without giving proper notice, throwing the entire class schedule into chaos. "I don't know how I'm going to handle the advanced students," she'd say, pacing around our kitchen like she was planning the D-Day invasion instead of figuring out who could teach downward dog on Thursday evenings. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting at our dinner table, nodding sympathetically while internally processing the fact that I'd spent my afternoon trying to verify whether a terrorist cell in Somalia had actually acquired the surface-to-air missiles they'd been bragging about on encrypted communications, or if they were just trying to impress potential recruits with equipment they didn't actually possess. But sure, honey, tell me more about how stressful it is when the new meditation cushions arrive in the wrong shade of purple. The operational tempo was relentless, but it was also addictive in a way that's hard to explain to someone whose biggest adrenaline rush comes from successfully parallel parking. There's something uniquely satisfying about being part of a machine that works in the shadows to keep the lights on and the bad guys guessing. Every piece of intelligence we gathered, every threat we identified, every operation we supported was another small victory in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. But the cost of that satisfaction was measured in relationships that couldn't survive the weight of secrets and a personal life that was basically an elaborate piece of performance art. I'd sit through Monica's dinner parties listening to her friends discuss their theories about international relations, theories that were usually about as accurate as weather forecasts from a magic 8-ball, while I kept my mouth shut about the actual factors driving global conflict. I'd watch her brother Julian lecture me about taking risks and seizing opportunities while I was literally risking my life to create opportunities for people like him to keep living in blissful ignorance. The training never really stops when you're in this line of work. You don't just learn how to analyze intelligence reports and write briefings that won't put generals to sleep. You learn how to read people, how to spot the micro expressions that reveal what someone's really thinking, how to project exactly the persona that will make people comfortable enough to tell you things they shouldn't. You become a student of human psychology not because it's intellectually interesting, but because your life might depend on understanding what motivates the guy sitting across from you in a cafe in Istanbul, which made living with Monica both easier and infinitely more complicated. Easier because I could read her moods and motivations like a book written in large print, so I always knew when to engage and when to just nod and make supportive noises. More complicated because once you start analyzing everyone's behavior through the lens of operational security, it's hard to turn that part of your brain off, even with the person you're supposed to trust most in the world. I'd watch her interact with her family and friends, cataloging the little social manipulations and power plays that seemed so important to them, while part of my mind was always running threat assessments and exit strategies out of pure habit. Not because I thought Monica's yoga instructor was secretly working for a foreign intelligence service, but because when you spend your professional life assuming everyone might be lying to you, it becomes difficult to fully relax even in your own living room. The irony was that Monica was constantly telling me I needed to be more assertive, more confident, more willing to take charge in social situations. What she didn't understand was that I spent my working hours being exactly those things. "You're so passive, Jack," she'd say after another evening of watching me politely deflect questions about my boring government job, while her friends shared their opinions about foreign policy based on what they'd skimmed in their news feeds. People walk all over you because you let them. You need to stand up for yourself more. If only she knew about the times I'd had to stand up to people who carried actual weapons instead of just strong opinions about gluten-free recipes. If only I could tell her about the meetings where disagreeing with me wasn't just uncomfortable. It was potentially dangerous for everyone involved. But operational security wasn't just about protecting classified information. It was about protecting the people around you from becoming targets because they knew too much about things they were never supposed to know. The compartmentalization required to maintain that kind of separation wasn't just professional, it was psychological. You had to become genuinely comfortable living as two completely different people, switching between identities so seamlessly that even you sometimes forgot which version of yourself you were supposed to be in any given moment. Jack Morrison had opinions about local politics and preferred restaurants and weekend plans. Echo 7 had access to intelligence reports that could change the course of international relations and contacts in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secrets. It was living with the knowledge that the person closest to you had no idea who you really were. Monica fell in love with Jack Morrison, the mild-mannered analyst who brought her coffee in bed and remembered to buy organic milk and never disagreed with her theories about crystal healing or whatever pseudo-spiritual trend she was exploring that week. She had no way of knowing that Jack Morrison was essentially a fictional character I'd created to make it possible for someone like her to sleep safely at night. But Echo 7 was the guy who understood exactly how fragile that safety really was, who knew how many different ways the comfortable suburban life Monica took for granted could be disrupted by people who played by very different rules. Echo 7 had seen what happened to countries where the intelligence services stopped doing their jobs effectively, where good intentions and wishful thinking replaced hard analysis and decisive action. The training scenarios we ran weren't abstract exercises. They were based on real-world situations where someone had to make the kind of choices that would keep them awake for years afterward. Do you authorize a drone strike based on intelligence that's 90% reliable, knowing that the 10% uncertainty could mean killing innocent people? Do you burn a valuable source to prevent an attack that might not happen? Or do you risk letting something slip through because you wanted to be absolutely sure? These weren't philosophical debates. They were Tuesday afternoon decisions that real people had to live with. And then I'd come home to Monica explaining how her day had been absolutely insane because two of her yoga students had gotten into an argument about whether hot yoga was better than traditional yoga, and she'd had to mediate the dispute like some kind of Zen referee. The contrast was so absurd it was almost funny, except that part of what made the work meaningful was protecting people's right to worry about things that ridiculous instead of actual life and death situations. But the beautiful thing about being consistently underestimated is that it gives you options other people don't have. When everyone assumes you're harmless, predictable, and slightly boring, they stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. They stop wondering about the phone calls you take in the other room, the business trips that don't quite add up, the way you seem to know things about current events before they hit the news. They just accept that you're exactly who you appear to be, which makes it infinitely easier to be someone else entirely when the situation calls for it. You know how they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Well, in my case, the apple fell, rolled down a hill, got picked up by a government agency, and was classified at a security level that would make most people's heads spin. But somehow, my old man figured it out anyway, because parents have this annoying habit of actually paying attention to their kids, even when those kids think they're being incredibly clever about hiding things. My father, Robert Bob Morrison, was the kind of guy who'd spent his whole life reading people like they were billboards on the highway, clear, obvious, and usually advertising something they didn't really want you to know about them. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat engineer, came home with a Bronze Star he never talked about and a bullshit detector that was calibrated to military precision. The man could spot a lie from 3 counties away, which made growing up interesting and made maintaining operational cover as an adult damn near impossible. Dad never asked direct questions about my work, but he had this way of watching me that made it clear he wasn't buying the whole government researcher story for a hot minute. He'd sit in his favorite recliner during family visits, nursing a beer and making the kind of small talk that seemed harmless until you realized he was building a case file in his head. "How's work treating you, son?" he'd ask, but his eyes were saying something more like, "I know you're not filing reports about agricultural subsidies, so what are you really doing with your life?" The breakthrough moment came about 4 years into my marriage, during one of those Sunday dinners that Monica insisted on hosting because she'd read an article about how shared meals strengthen family bonds. Dad was helping me grill burgers in the backyard while Monica and Mom were inside discussing the importance of using organic vegetables and whether we should switch to grass-fed beef for health reasons. You know, the kind of first-world problems that occupy people who've never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. "Jack," Dad said, flipping a burger with the precision of someone who'd learned to cook over actual campfires instead of designer gas grills. "You mind if I ask you something?" The way he said it made it clear this wasn't going to be a question about burger doneness or whether we needed more propane. "Sure, Dad. What's on your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the smoke rise from the grill like he was reading smoke signals from some invisible tribal elder. "That trip you took to Germany last month. The one for the agricultural conference." I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that comes when someone starts poking at the edges of your cover story with uncomfortable accuracy. "Yeah, what about it?" "Funny thing about that conference," he continued, still focused on the burgers, but speaking in that casual tone that retired military guys use when they're about to drop a bomb. "I looked it up online. Turns out it was canceled 2 weeks before you left. Something about venue issues." Now, most people in my situation would have panicked, started scrambling for an explanation, maybe gotten defensive about their father questioning their story. But I'd been trained by professionals who ate amateur interrogators for breakfast, so I just nodded and said, "Yeah, the whole thing was a mess." Ended up being more of an informal meeting between a few researchers. Not really worth talking about. Dad finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not suspicion, not disappointment, but something that looked almost like pride mixed with concern. "Son," he said, "I don't know what you really do for work, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I want you to know that whatever it is, I'm proud of you, and I'm worried about you. Because a man doesn't learn to lie that well unless he's protecting something important." That's when I knew the jig was up, at least as far as Dad was concerned. You can fool a lot of people with a good cover story and consistent details, but you can't fool someone who raised you from birth and knows exactly how you sound when you're telling the truth versus when you're selling them a load of carefully crafted fiction. "Dad, I'm not asking for details, Jack. I know you can't give them to me, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them. But I need you to know that I see you, son. I see what you're carrying around, and I know it's not easy." We stood there in comfortable silence for a while. Two guys who'd never been great at emotional conversations suddenly understanding each other perfectly without having to spell anything out. Dad had figured out that his son wasn't really a desk jockey pushing paper for agricultural researchers, and I'd figured out that my father was a hell of a lot more perceptive than I'd given him credit for. The conversation never went any further than that, because Dad understood operational security even if he didn't know the technical terms for it. But from that day forward, there was this unspoken acknowledgement between us. He'd ask about work in vague terms, and I'd give him vague answers, and we both understood that the vagueness was protecting everyone involved. Monica never picked up on the subtle shift in our dynamic, because Monica was too busy planning her next yoga workshop to notice the way her father-in-law's questions had evolved from polite small talk to carefully respectful recognition. When Dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years later, I think part of him was almost relieved. Not because he wanted to die. Nobody wants that. But because he'd lived long enough to see his son become the kind of man who could handle the real responsibilities that most people never even know exist. He'd done his job as a father, which was to raise someone strong enough to do whatever needed doing, even if he never got credit for it. The last few months were rough, but Dad faced them the same way he'd faced everything else in his life, head-on, with minimal complaints, and with a dry sense of humor that kept everyone else from falling apart completely. He'd make jokes about the hospital food being worse than military rations, and about how the nurses were tougher than any drill sergeant he'd ever met. But in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, he'd ask questions that let me know he was still thinking about the son who'd disappeared into the shadow world of government service. "You taking care of yourself, son?" he'd ask, and I knew he wasn't talking about eating enough vegetables or getting regular exercise. "Yeah, Dad. I'm being careful." "Good. Because the world needs guys like you, but Monica needs you too. Don't forget that there's more than one way to serve your country." Those conversations were the closest we ever came to explicitly acknowledging what I really did for work, but they were enough. Dad knew. I knew he knew, and we both understood that some things were better left unspoken even between family members who trusted each other completely. When he started working on his will with the family lawyer, Dad insisted on handling certain parts of it himself. Mom thought he was just being his usual controlling self, wanting to micromanage every detail, even when he was dying. Monica assumed he was worried about making sure the financial arrangements were fair and clearly spelled out. Even I figured he was just trying to maintain some sense of control during a process that was fundamentally about accepting powerlessness. But Dad had something else in mind entirely. Something that wouldn't become clear until months later, when that will became the centerpiece of Monica's legal strategy to destroy my reputation and claim I'd been lying about my service record. Because my father, bless his sneaky old soul, had written one single sentence that would eventually change everything. I acknowledge my son Jack's quiet, unseen service to our country. One sentence, 22 words. That was it. No details, no specifics, no classified information that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger anyone's safety. Just a simple acknowledgement from a father who'd figured out that his son was carrying burdens that couldn't be shared and making sacrifices that couldn't be recognized publicly. At the time, it seemed like a nice gesture, the kind of thing grieving families point to as evidence that their loved one was thinking about them right up to the end. Mom teared up when the lawyer read it during the initial will reading. And even Monica seemed touched by what she interpreted as her father-in-law's way of validating her husband's government research work. My sister made some comment about how Dad had always been proud of my steady career, completely missing the deeper implications of that carefully chosen language. But Dad wasn't writing that sentence for the immediate family audience. He was writing it for the future, for the moment when someone might try to question whether his son had really served his country with honor. He was creating a piece of documentary evidence that couldn't be dismissed as easily as the lies people tell themselves about other people's lives. The beautiful thing about my father's approach was how perfectly it balanced discretion with protection. He couldn't provide details about classified service without potentially breaking federal laws and definitely compromising operational security. But he could provide acknowledgement, recognition from someone whose own military service gave him the credibility to make that kind of statement. And he could do it in language that was specific enough to mean something to people who mattered while remaining vague enough to avoid creating security risks. What Dad understood, And what Monica never would was that some forms of service don't come with parades or public recognition or even the right to tell your own family what you've been doing with your life. Some forms of service require you to let people think you're boring, ineffective, maybe even a little pathetic, because the alternative is painting a target on everyone you care about. He also understood that someday, someone might try to use my cover identity against me, to turn my dedication to operational security into evidence that I was lying about everything. And when that day came, I'd need someone in my corner who had the standing to vouch for me without compromising anyone's safety. So Dad wrote his little clause, tucked it into his will like a time bomb set to explode whenever someone tried to question my honor, and then went to his grave knowing he'd done everything he could to protect his son from the kind of people who mistake discretion for dishonesty. The really twisted part is that Monica's decision to challenge that clause in court, to turn my father's recognition into evidence of deception, was exactly the kind of move that would force me to prove she was wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Dad probably wouldn't have approved of the nuclear option we ended up deploying, but I like to think he would have appreciated the irony of watching his daughter-in-law's attack on his son's honor become the very thing that revealed just how wrong she'd been about everything. You ever have one of those moments where you realize you're about to watch someone's entire world implode, and you're the guy holding the detonator? That's exactly where I found myself 6 months after Dad's funeral, sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the divorce papers Monica had just served me like they were a declaration of war. Which, in hindsight, they basically were. The whole thing started because Monica couldn't let Dad's will alone. Most rational people would have taken that inheritance, said thank you to the deceased, and moved on with their lives. But Monica wasn't most people. She was a woman on a mission to prove that her boring husband had been living a lie, and that single sentence about my quiet, unseen service was driving her absolutely nuts. She'd spent weeks obsessing over it, analyzing it like it was some kind of coded message instead of exactly what it appeared to be, a father's recognition of his son's work. "It doesn't make sense, Jack," she'd say, pacing around our kitchen with the manic energy of a conspiracy theorist who'd found a loose thread in the official story. "If you really served your country in some meaningful way, where are your benefits? Where are your medical records? Where's any proof that you did anything more than push papers around a government office?" I'd sit there, sipping my coffee and watching this woman I'd been married to for 8 years slowly work herself up into a frenzy over something she couldn't possibly understand, thinking about all the ways I could have ended this conversation with a single phone call. But operational security isn't just about protecting classified information. It's about protecting the people around you from becoming collateral damage in other people's wars. So when Monica announced she was filing for divorce and planning to contest Dad's will on the grounds that I'd committed fraud by misrepresenting my military service, I did what any reasonable person in my situation would do. I called Grant Morrison, the best damn military lawyer I'd ever had the pleasure of working with. Grant was one of those guys who looked like he'd been born wearing a dress uniform, all sharp angles and precise movements, with the kind of bearing that made junior officers automatically stand up straighter when he walked into a room. We'd worked together on a few cases back when he was still active duty JAG, before he'd retired and gone into private practice defending people who couldn't defend themselves through normal legal channels. "Jack," he said when I explained the situation, "your wife is about to step on the biggest legal landmine in the continental United States, and she doesn't even know it exists." Yeah, well, Monica's always been confident in her ability to figure things out. Grant was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his legal brain. "You know we're going to have to go nuclear on this, right? I mean completely nuclear. There's no halfway measure that's going to convince a family court judge without compromising operational security for half the intelligence community." "I know, and you understand that once we drop this particular bomb, there's no putting the fallout back in the bottle? Your cover identity is going to be burned 6 ways from Sunday." I thought about that for a moment, weighing the cost of exposure against the cost of letting Monica turn my father's recognition into evidence of fraud. "Grant, at this point, I'm retired in everything but name. And frankly, I'm tired of being treated like a disappointment by people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the world I've been protecting them from." "Fair enough. In that case, let's give your wife exactly what she's asking for. The plan Grant outlined was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. We weren't going to argue Monica's case or try to poke holes in her logic. We weren't going to bring in character witnesses or produce alternative evidence of my government service. Instead, we were going to let her make her accusations under oath in federal court, and then we were going to show the judge exactly how wrong she was. The key, Grant explained during one of our planning sessions, is to let her commit fully to the fraud narrative. We need her to go on record stating categorically that you never served your country in any meaningful capacity, that your father's acknowledgement was based on lies you told him, and that there's no legitimate basis for his recognition of your service. And then we hand the judge a letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence confirming that you are, in fact, a decorated intelligence officer whose service record is classified at levels that require special security clearances just to acknowledge its existence. I had to admit, there was something deeply satisfying about the prospect of watching Monica's carefully constructed case explode in her face like a defective firework. She'd spent so much time and energy building this narrative about her fraud of a husband that she'd never stopped to consider whether she might be fundamentally wrong about everything. But getting that letter wasn't going to be easy. The ODNI doesn't hand out confirmation letters for divorce proceedings, even when those proceedings involve baseless accusations of stolen valor. It took months of bureaucratic maneuvering, security reviews, and conversations with people whose names I can't mention in polite company. But eventually Grant managed to secure what was essentially a judicial nuclear weapon disguised as official correspondence. "Jack," he said when the letter finally arrived, sealed with enough official seals to decorate a Christmas tree. "I want you to understand that this document could end careers, compromise ongoing operations, and generally create the kind of bureaucratic chaos that gives senior intelligence officials nightmares. And your wife is about to find out why pissing off the intelligence community is considered a career-limiting move in certain circles." The beautiful irony was that Monica had no idea she was walking into what was essentially a legal ambush designed by people who specialized in making problems disappear. She thought she was fighting a divorce case against her underachieving husband. What she was actually doing was challenging the operational security of the United States intelligence community, which takes a remarkably dim view of people who make their jobs more difficult than they already are. Grant and I spent weeks rehearsing our strategy, timing our moves like we were planning a military operation instead of a court hearing. We knew Monica would lead with her accusations about my supposed fraudulent claims of service. We knew she'd bring up Dad's will as evidence of my deception. And we knew she'd commit fully to the narrative that I was nothing more than a government clerk with delusions of grandeur. "The moment she makes those accusations under oath," Grant explained, "she crosses a line that turns this from a civil divorce proceeding into something that federal prosecutors take very seriously. Falsely accusing a classified government operative of stolen valor isn't just slander. It's potentially a federal crime. So we're not just defending against her divorce case. Son, we're not defending at all. We're about to demonstrate to a family court judge why certain people's personal lives are classified information and why some questions are better left unasked." The night before the hearing, I sat in my empty apartment. Monica had moved out months ago, taking most of the furniture and all of the houseplants, thinking about how different my life was going to be after tomorrow. My cover identity was about to become a historical curiosity, my marriage was about to become a cautionary tale, and Monica was about to learn that some secrets are classified for very good reasons. But more than anything, I was thinking about Dad, and how proud he'd be to know that his one little sentence was about to prove more powerful than all of Monica's carefully crafted accusations combined. If you've never watched someone walk confidently into their own destruction while thinking they're heading toward their greatest triumph, let me tell you, it's simultaneously the most satisfying and most uncomfortable thing you'll ever witness. Like watching a really elaborate magic trick where the volunteer from the audience has no idea they're about to become the punchline of a joke that's been 6 months in the making. Divorce day arrived with all the fanfare of a root canal appointment, complete with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were recovering from the flu and chairs that had clearly been designed by someone who'd never actually sat in one. The courthouse was one of those aggressively beige government buildings that seemed specifically engineered to crush the human spirit, which seemed appropriate given what was about to happen to Monica's carefully constructed case. Monica strutted into that courtroom like she was walking the red carpet at the Oscars, wearing what I recognized as her power suit, a black number that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and made her look like she was either attending a very important business meeting or planning to deliver a eulogy for my reputation. Her confidence was practically radioactive. You could have powered a small city with the sheer force of her conviction that she was about to expose the greatest fraud in family court history. Her lawyer, Trevor Daniels, followed behind her like an overly enthusiastic golden retriever who'd just been told there were tennis balls in the courtroom. Trevor was one of those guys who'd apparently learned his legal strategy from watching too many courtroom dramas, all flashy suits and dramatic gestures without much substance underneath the performance. The man's tie was so shiny it could have served as a backup mirror for the courthouse bathroom, and his smile had that quality you usually see on people who are either selling something you don't want or about to ask if you've accepted Jesus Christ as your personal savior. I watched them set up at their table with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested they'd rehearsed this moment multiple times, probably in Trevor's office with Monica playing both the wronged wife and the sympathetic judge. Trevor arranged his papers with the care of someone handling ancient scrolls, while Monica positioned herself at the perfect angle to project wounded dignity to the gallery where my so-called family sat waiting for the show to begin. And what a show they expected. My mother and sister had claimed seats in the front row like they'd bought tickets to the hottest play in town, complete with the kind of barely contained excitement that people usually reserve for watching car crashes or reality TV finales. Monica's family had turned out in force too, a whole cheering section of people who'd spent years treating me like I was lucky they tolerated my presence at their gatherings. Julian was there, of course, probably hoping to get some material for future family gatherings where he could regale everyone with stories about the day his pathetic brother-in-law got exposed as a fraud. Big Jim had squeezed himself into what was clearly his funeral suit, looking like a man who'd come to witness justice being served with a side of public humiliation. Even Monica's grandmother had made the trip, wheeled in by a nurse who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth. Meanwhile, Grant and I sat at our table like we were waiting for a routine custody hearing instead of what was about to become the legal equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Grant had that same calm demeanor he'd had during our military days, when he'd walk into court-martial proceedings knowing he had evidence that would completely demolish the prosecution's case. The man could have been waiting for a bus instead of preparing to detonate the nuclear option we'd spent months putting together. The envelope was sitting in Grant's briefcase like a sleeping dragon, officially sealed and practically humming with the kind of bureaucratic power that could change the trajectory of someone's entire life. I'd seen that envelope every day for the past week during our final preparations, but I still couldn't quite believe we were actually going to use it. It felt like holding a grenade with the pin already pulled, incredibly dangerous and absolutely necessary at the same time. Judge Harrison walked in looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which was pretty much standard operating procedure for family court judges who'd seen enough bitter divorces to know that everyone was probably lying about something. The man had the weary expression of someone who'd spent years listening to people's worst impulses dressed up as legal arguments, and he clearly expected this case to be more of the same domestic drama that filled his calendar every day. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and we all went through the ritualistic theater that precedes legal proceedings, standing and sitting like we were participating in some kind of judicial aerobics class. Judge Harrison shuffled through his papers with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing quarterly tax reports, probably wondering why this particular divorce required a full hearing instead of just being settled out of court like most rational people would handle it. But Monica wasn't most rational people. She was a woman on a mission, absolutely convinced that she was about to deliver the performance of her lifetime and finally get the recognition she deserved for uncovering her husband's web of lies. When Trevor stood up to deliver their opening statement, Monica leaned forward in her chair like she was watching the season finale of her favorite show. "Your Honor," Trevor began, his voice carrying that particular blend of righteous indignation and practiced sincerity that personal injury lawyers perfect over years of pretending their clients' fender benders were life-altering tragedies. "We are here today because my client has discovered that her marriage was built on a foundation of lies and deception that goes to the very heart of her husband's character. He gestured toward me like I was Exhibit A in a museum of human disappointment, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. Mr. Morrison has spent 8 years of marriage claiming to be something he's not, accepting recognition he didn't earn, and allowing his family, including his own father, to believe he served his country with honor when the truth is far different. Monica was practically glowing at this point, nodding along with every word like Trevor was delivering the Gettysburg Address instead of what was essentially a very expensive accusation that her husband was a pathetic wannabe. She'd clearly practiced her wounded but dignified expression in the mirror, and she was deploying it with the precision of a trained actress hitting her mark. The defendant has no military service records, no veterans' benefits, no evidence whatsoever of the heroic service he's allowed people to believe he performed. Trevor continued, building toward what he clearly thought was going to be his devastating conclusion. In fact, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Morrison is nothing more than a low-level government clerk who has built an elaborate fantasy around his mundane job in order to make himself seem more important than he actually is. That's when Monica delivered her big line, the moment she'd clearly been rehearsing for months. She stood up slightly in her chair, looked directly at me with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who kick puppies or steal from charity, and said in a voice that carried to the back of the courtroom, "No benefits, no claims, he's a fake vet." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I had to admire her delivery. If sarcasm were a martial art, Monica would definitely have earned her black belt. The confidence, the timing, the way she projected just the right amount of moral outrage. It was actually impressive, in a train wreck kind of way. The audience ate it up. I could hear the satisfied murmurs from the gallery, the sound of people who thought they were finally going to see justice served to someone who'd had the audacity to pretend he was better than them. Julian looked like Christmas morning, and his birthday had arrived simultaneously. Even my own mother was nodding along, apparently convinced that her daughter-in-law had just delivered the smoking gun that would finally explain why her son had always seemed so mysteriously unremarkable. I leaned back in my chair, feeling that familiar calm that comes from knowing you're holding all the aces while everyone else is betting their life savings on a pair of twos. Monica had just swallowed the bait whole, hook and all, and she was so focused on her moment of triumph that she couldn't see the trap closing around her. Grant caught my eye and raised an eyebrow slightly, our prearranged signal that it was time to end this particular performance. He reached into his briefcase with the deliberate precision of someone handling high explosives, pulled out that innocent-looking envelope with its official seals and classified markings, and prepared to turn Monica's greatest moment into her absolute worst nightmare. She'd wanted drama, demanded proof, insisted on turning our divorce into a public referendum on my honor and service. Well, she was about to get exactly what she'd asked for, just not in the way she'd imagined. You know that moment in action movies when the hero finally reveals they've been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers? That moment when the music swells and you realize the mild-mannered guy everyone underestimated is actually 3 steps ahead of the bad guys? Well, real life is a lot quieter than that, but it's infinitely more satisfying when you're the one holding the winning hand. Grant slid that envelope across the table to Judge Harrison like he was passing a dinner roll instead of delivering what amounted to a legal neutron bomb. The movement was so casual, so understated, that for a moment nobody in the courtroom really understood what they were looking at. Even Monica kept that smug little smile on her face, probably thinking this was just some desperate last-minute paperwork that would only confirm what she'd already proven, that her pathetic husband was exactly as disappointing as she'd always known he was. Judge Harrison picked up the envelope with the kind of weary curiosity that comes from 20 years of family court, where dramatic revelations usually amount to someone's cousin testifying about who really owns the jet skis. The man had probably opened 10,000 pieces of correspondence that promised to change everything and delivered nothing more interesting than itemized receipts for couples therapy sessions that didn't work. But the moment he saw those official seals, not the kind you buy at Office Depot, but the real deal, with watermarks and security features that would make a Treasury agent nod approvingly, his entire demeanor shifted. Judge Harrison had been around government long enough to recognize when something carried the kind of weight that could ruin careers and end political ambitions, and this envelope was practically radioactive with official authority. He cracked the wax seal with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, which wasn't far from what he was actually doing. The first page was standard bureaucratic cover letter material, but I watched his eyes widen as he reached the second page, then the third, then what I knew was the money shot. A letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that confirmed everything Monica had just spent the last hour claiming was impossible. The transformation was incredible to watch. Judge Harrison went through more facial expressions in 30 seconds than most people cycle through during an entire emotional breakdown. First, there was mild curiosity, the kind of look you get when you're opening mail that might be important, but probably isn't. Then confusion, as his brain tried to process information that didn't fit with anything he'd been told about this case. Then his eyebrows shot up like they were trying to escape his forehead entirely, and his mouth dropped open just slightly, the way people look when they realize they're standing in the middle of something much bigger than they'd bargained for. Finally, his face settled into an expression that I can only describe as holy shit. I did not sign up for this level of federal complications when I became a family court judge. If his poker face had been a house, it would have been foreclosed, demolished, and turned into a Walmart parking lot faster than you could say classified information. The silence in that courtroom was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Monica's confident smile started to falter as she registered that something had fundamentally changed in the room's dynamic, but she couldn't figure out what. Trevor was still shuffling through his papers like he was looking for the next part of his prepared presentation, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire case had just been vaporized by whatever was in that innocent-looking envelope. Judge Harrison looked up from the letter, his face now completely serious in a way that made everyone in the courtroom unconsciously sit up straighter. This wasn't the bored, slightly irritated expression he'd been wearing since he walked in that morning. This was the look of a man who'd just realized he was dealing with something that could end up on the evening news if he handled it wrong. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that cut through the silence like a knife, "seal this court immediately." Those 5 words hit the courtroom like a grenade going off in a library. The casual chatter from the gallery died instantly. Monica's theatrical breathing seemed to pause mid-inhale. Even Trevor's paper shuffling stopped, leaving behind the kind of absolute silence that usually only exists in morgues and abandoned churches. Then came the real sound effects. The heavy footsteps of bailiffs who suddenly looked a lot more serious about their jobs, the solid thunk of locks clicking into place with the finality of prison doors, the metallic scrape of deadbolts sliding home like the sound of a vault being sealed. Each sound seemed to echo in the suddenly smaller space, reminding everyone present that what had started as a routine divorce hearing had just become something that required federal-level security protocols. That's when Monica's Oscar-worthy performance hit its first major snag. Her confident smirk, the one she'd been wearing like a crown throughout her entire testimony, collapsed faster than a cheap camping chair in a hurricane. For the first time since we'd walked into this courtroom, she looked genuinely confused instead of strategically devastated. Her eyes darted from the sealed doors to the judge to me, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly had too many pieces. You could literally see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't part of the script she'd been rehearsing. This wasn't how divorce court was supposed to work. Normal people didn't have their hearings sealed by federal mandate unless someone had seriously misjudged the situation. "What's happening?" she whispered to Trevor, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. But Trevor looked about as confused as she did, probably running through his law school training and coming up empty on the proper protocol for when family court suddenly becomes a matter of national security. The judge was still holding that letter, and I could see his hands were actually trembling slightly. Whatever Grant had put in that envelope, it had definitely gotten the man's undivided attention. He kept looking from the letter to me, like he was seeing me for the first time and trying to reconcile what he'd been told about the boring government clerk with whatever information was spelled out in official government letterhead. "Mrs. Jensen," Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to the kind of serious tone that judges usually reserve for sentencing hearings. "You are accusing a United States government operative on federal record. You may have just committed a crime." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Monica's jaw dropped so far I was surprised it didn't unhinge completely. Her face went through this fascinating color progression from confused pink to shocked white to what could only be described as, oh shit, pale. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, Monica was completely, utterly speechless. Trevor looked like he needed a bathroom break and possibly a career change. The man's shiny tie suddenly seemed less like a fashion statement and more like a noose he'd accidentally put around his own neck. He kept glancing between his notes and the judge like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all an elaborate prank, and he could go back to handling normal divorces where the biggest revelation was usually hidden bank accounts or affairs with the tennis instructor. The gallery was dead silent except for the sound of Julian's jaw hitting the floor somewhere behind me. Big Jim looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. Even my own mother seemed to be reconsidering everything she thought she knew about her son's career prospects. I almost laughed out loud. After years of being treated like the family disappointment, the underachieving husband who couldn't even manage to be impressive at his boring government job, I was finally watching reality crash into their carefully constructed fantasy about who I was and what I'd been doing with my life. Monica was staring at me like I'd just transformed into someone she'd never seen before, which wasn't far from the truth. The mild-mannered librarian she'd been married to for 8 years had just been revealed as something else entirely, and she was trying to process the cognitive dissonance of discovering that her greatest disappointment might actually have been her biggest misjudgment. But the best part was yet to come. Because Judge Harrison was still reading that letter, and with each page he turned, his expression grew more serious and Monica's situation grew more complicated. She'd wanted drama, demanded proof, insisted on turning our divorce into a public trial of my character and service. Well, she was about to get exactly what she'd asked for, just not in the way she'd imagined. There's something deeply satisfying about walking out of a courthouse knowing you've just witnessed someone else's carefully constructed reality implode like a house of cards in a hurricane. The feeling is even better when that someone spent the better part of 8 years treating you like you were lucky they bothered to remember your name. I stepped out into the afternoon sunlight with Grant beside me, feeling about 10 pounds lighter and infinitely more vindicated than I'd felt in years. The hearing had ended with all the fanfare of a funeral, which seemed appropriate since we'd basically just buried Monica's case so deep it would need archaeological excavation to find it again. Judge Harrison had dismissed her fraud allegations with the kind of finality that comes from realizing you've just watched someone accuse a decorated government operative of stolen valor on federal record. The man looked like he needed a very strong drink and possibly a career change by the time he'd finished reading through all the classified documentation Grant had somehow managed to procure. Monica, meanwhile, had been escorted out through a side door by 2 very serious-looking gentlemen who'd appeared about halfway through the proceedings like they'd materialized out of thin air. Which, knowing how these things work, they probably had. When federal security protocols get activated in a family court setting, it tends to attract the attention of people whose job descriptions don't appear on any public organizational charts. But it was what happened next that really drove home just how spectacularly Monica had miscalculated the situation she'd walked herself into. Grant and I were standing on the courthouse steps, enjoying the kind of perfect autumn afternoon that makes you forget why you ever complained about the weather, when I spotted them across the street. 2 U.S. Marshals, dressed in those unremarkable dark suits that scream federal law enforcement to anyone who knows what to look for, were escorting Monica toward a black government SUV that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line of someone's worst bureaucratic nightmare. The vehicle was the kind of official transportation that doesn't appear in any government fleet registry, the kind that exists specifically for situations where regular law enforcement procedures aren't quite sufficient to handle the complexity of someone's legal problems. Monica looked absolutely terrified, which was a refreshing change from her usual expression of barely contained contempt for everyone around her. Her carefully styled hair was starting to frizz in the afternoon humidity. Her power suit was wrinkled from stress sweating, and her face had that pale, shell-shocked look that people get when they realize they've just stepped on a landmine they didn't even know existed. The really beautiful part was watching her try to maintain some semblance of dignity while being guided into federal custody by people who were clearly way out of her social league. Monica had spent years being the biggest fish in her very small suburban pond, commanding respect at yoga studios and dinner parties where her opinion actually mattered to people who cared about her theories on organic vegetables and chakra alignment. But these guys weren't yoga students or book club members who could be impressed by her latest insights into conscious living. These were federal marshals whose day job involved dealing with people who made Monica's suburban drama look like a kindergarten playground dispute. They treated her with the kind of professional courtesy that comes from years of handling situations where someone's personal crisis has accidentally intersected with national security concerns. For a moment, just a moment, our eyes met across the street. Monica looked at me through the SUV's tinted window with this expression that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not contempt, not even disappointment. It was something that looked almost like recognition, like she was finally seeing me for the first time instead of seeing the fictional character she'd created in her head. There was something in her eyes that said, "Fix this, Jack. You always fix everything." It was the same look she'd given me when her yoga studio's permit got delayed, or when her sister needed someone to co-sign a loan, or when any of the 100 small crises that make up normal life required someone competent to step in and handle the details while she focused on more important things like finding her authentic self. But this wasn't a permit problem or a family loan situation. This was the kind of mess that happens when someone decides to challenge the operational security of the United States intelligence community without bothering to understand what they're actually challenging. This was what happens when you mistake someone's dedication to maintaining their cover identity for evidence that they're living a lie. I gave her my best polite smile, the one that says, "I'd love to help, but I'm retired from babysitting grown adults who should have known better." It was the same smile I'd been perfecting for years during family dinners when she'd lecture me about taking more risks and living life to the fullest, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd been doing exactly that while she was trying to manifest abundance through positive visualization. Then I turned and walked away, the sound of my shoes clicking on the courthouse steps providing the only soundtrack I needed for this particular moment. Behind me, I could hear the SUV's engine starting, followed by the distinctive sound of federal law enforcement vehicles pulling away from the curb with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggests the passengers won't be home for dinner. Grant fell into step beside me as we headed toward the parking garage, both of us walking with the relaxed pace of people who'd just successfully concluded a mission that had required months of careful planning and precise execution. "You know," he said after we'd walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, "I've been practicing law for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone walk into a federal prosecution quite that enthusiastically." "Monica's always been overconfident in her ability to figure things out," I replied. "It's just that this time, the thing she was trying to figure out was classified at levels that require special clearances just to acknowledge it exists." "Think she'll learn from this experience?" I considered that question as we reached my car, thinking about 8 years of marriage to someone who'd been absolutely convinced that her boring government clerk husband was the biggest disappointment in her otherwise fascinating life. "Grant," I said, unlocking the doors, "I think Monica's about to get the kind of education they don't offer at yoga teacher training programs." As I drove home to my empty apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on the cosmic justice of it all. Monica had spent years treating me like I was lucky she bothered to stay married to someone so thoroughly unremarkable. Now she was getting a very expensive lesson in why some people's lives are classified information and why some questions are better left unasked. 3 months later, I found myself standing in a sterile government building that doesn't appear on any public maps, wearing my dress uniform for the first time in years and feeling like I'd finally come home. The ceremony was small, private, and attended exclusively by people who understood exactly what it meant to receive recognition that would never appear in any newspaper or show up on anyone's social media feed. General Peterson, a guy who'd forgotten more about international security than most people ever learn, pinned a medal on my chest that was worth more than all of Monica's yoga certifications combined. It wasn't the kind of award you display on your mantelpiece or mention at cocktail parties. It was the kind of medal that comes with its own classification level and a handshake from people who don't waste words on small talk. 23 years of service, the general said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what those years had cost. Operations in 14 countries, intelligence that prevented God knows how many catastrophes, and a dedication to operational security that kept everyone around you safe. He paused, looking me in the eye with the kind of respect that can't be faked. Your country owes you a debt it can never properly acknowledge. My real family was there. Not the people who'd shared DNA or holiday dinners with me, but the men and women who'd trusted me with their lives and secrets in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. These were people who knew that heroism doesn't always come with parades, and that sometimes the greatest service requires letting everyone think you're ordinary. A week later, my phone buzzed with a text message that would have been hilarious if it weren't so predictable. It was from Helen, Monica's mother, the woman who'd spent years explaining to anyone who'd listen how disappointed she was in her daughter's choice of husband. Monica's facing federal charges. The message read, "Please help. Can you make a call?" I stared at that text for about 30 seconds, thinking about all the family dinners where I'd been treated like an unwelcome guest at my own life. All the times Helen had introduced me as Monica's husband, the librarian, like she was apologizing for my existence. I deleted the message without responding. Then, because I couldn't resist, I muttered to myself the words that had started this whole beautiful disaster. No benefits, no claims. Guess she's the fake vet now. The irony was perfect, even if no one else would ever fully appreciate it. Monica had spent 8 years married to someone whose job was protecting people exactly like her, and she'd thrown it all away because she couldn't stand the idea that her boring husband might have been extraordinary all along. But that's the thing about underestimating people. Eventually, reality catches up with your assumptions, and the bill for being wrong comes due with interest.